So in the beginning, God made everything good. In the beginning, everything God made was beautiful. Everything God made was wonderful. And it was all a reflection of His beauty and His wonder. Because He is the fullness of beauty. He is the fullness of wonder. He made a world that was beautiful, wonderful. And within that world, He made us. And He made us to reflect His beauty and His wonder so that we would be fruitful and multiply. So that we would love one another as He loves us. He made a world that was beautiful and wonderful, and He made it for us. And He made it so that we would do beautiful things and wonderful things for each other. So that we, as His children, would resemble His beauty and His wonder. And that resemblance is what makes us His children. That the love He poured into our hearts, we would pour that to others. And the love we poured into the lives of others would give strength to others to do beautiful things and wonderful things. But after the fall, our hearts were influenced by the darkness of this world. After the fall, the desires of our heart no longer resembled the desires of God's heart. The desires of our heart resembled the darkness of this world. God's plan was that we would resemble His beauty and His wonder, and in that resemblance, we would be His children. God's plan was that we would be used by God to serve others. But when the darkness came into our hearts, we turned away from God's plan. Instead of being used by God to serve others, we used others to serve ourselves. These were the plans growing in the hearts of people now influenced by the darkness of this world. When darkness came into this world, the desires of our heart in the beginning, the desire of our heart was to find pleasure in being a child of God. Our heart's desire, once upon a time, in the days of Adam, when the desire of our heart was to find pleasure by being a child of God. But when darkness came into the world, the desire of our heart was to find pleasure in being God. And one of the most tragic examples of this was when God's people were overpowered by the Egyptian Empire. God's people were slaves to the sinful desires of the Egyptian kings. The Egyptians were a people who had no relationship to the living God. And the people, the Israelites, who had a relationship with the living God, they were slaves to the Egyptians. And if you're a Christian, if you're a child of God, this is your family. The people who had a relationship with the living God, they are your family. And our family were once slaves to the Egyptian Empire. And in slavery, it was impossible to live the lives God made us for. It was impossible to do the beautiful things and wonderful things God made us for. Because in slavery, our slave masters sucked the life out of us. All our time and energy was spent serving the sinful desires of the rulers of this world. At that time, it was the Egyptians. All our time and energy was spent serving the sinful desires of the Egyptian Empire. And in that slavery, it was impossible to do what God made us to do. In that slavery, it was impossible to live lives that revealed that we resembled our Father in heaven. It was impossible to live lives that resembled the beauty and wonder of God. So God freed the Israelites from the Egyptians. God freed His people, the Israelites. He freed them from their slave masters. He freed them from the Egyptians. And that's why the prophet says, "Out of Egypt I called my son." God freed His people from Egypt. God set His people free from Egypt. And His plan was that when they were out of Egypt, they would live lives that revealed the glory of God. In that freedom, they would live lives that revealed the beauty and wonder of God. They would live lives that revealed that they resembled their Father in heaven. And that resemblance would reveal that they were children of God. Out of Egypt, I called my son. God called His people out of Egypt. God set His people free from Egypt so that in that freedom, they could live lives that revealed that they resembled their Father in heaven. They would live lives that revealed the beauty and wonder of God, the glory of God. But then something tragic happened. In that freedom, God's people became slaves to their own sinful desires. So initially, God's people were slaves to the sinful desires of the Egyptians. Initially, God's people were slaves. Initially, God's people were slaves to the sinful desires of the rulers of this world. Then God set His people free. But in that freedom, God's people became slaves to their own sinful desires. And as God's people became slaves to their own sinful desires, they found pleasure in sin. The sin that initially gave them pleasure would inevitably steal their strength. What initially gave them pleasure would inevitably steal their strength. That's why Jesus said, the devil comes to steal, kill, and destroy. Before he kills you and destroys you, he steals. He'll steal the wisdom God gave you. He'll steal the strength God gave you, so that you make decisions that suck the life out of you. And when you live for those sinful pleasures that steal your strength, you become overpowered by the powers of this world. So it's so tragic. God set his people free from captivity. God set his people free from the powers of this world. But in that freedom, they lived lives of sin, where the sin that initially gave them pleasure would inevitably steal their strength. And with their strength stolen, with their energy robbed, God's people were overpowered by the powers of this world.